Fear Point, Episode 2, What a View, written and performed by Kevin Duffy. Tony Morris was a steel worker. He'd been doing it for over 20 years now. Unlike most of the regular guys on his crew, Tony actually liked what he did for a living. Sure, his back and his knees ached something fierce, but he loved helping create something from nothing. Painters had their canvases, musicians had their instruments, Tony had his steel. In late summer 2021, Tony found himself working on an 8-story high-rise in Santa Barbara, right on the beach. It was a little far from his home in Modesto, but the boss won the bid and the whole crew had to relocate for the summer. For some of the guys, this job was a major inconvenience. They had families and loved ones. They were going to be apart from them for months on end. The boss had those guys working on a rotation so they could have longer weekends back up north, but Tony had no one to go back to. His parents both died when he was very young, cancer in both cases. He hadn't had anything resembling a steady girlfriend in over 7 years. He didn't even have a fish to take care of back home. So he let some of the other guys take his weekend rotations. He opted to stay in the beach community. Actually, a nice change of pace for him. Tony had become increasingly infatuated with the view of the sun from the top of the structure. The bright colors exploded from the farthest parts of the sea. It was breathtaking. The crew always left as one unit each night. It was a site safety protocol, and the site safety was always of utmost importance on any of their jobs, let alone a massive build like this one. He really couldn't explain it, but Tony needed to see that sunset. It was all he'd been thinking about for over the last couple weeks. And with the job wrapping up soon, he wasn't sure he was going to get another shot. So he came up with a plan. It was simple. Probably wouldn't even work, but he had to try. It was the Thursday before the Labor Day weekend. The boss had given everyone the Friday off, so the entire crew was eager to get back up north. After locking up the supplies in the tool shed, the last remaining crew made their way out to their cars. "Ah, fuck," Tony said aloud as he quickly searched his pockets. "I think I left my keys over by the shitter." Danny Whitfeld, the youngest guy on the crew, stopped outside his car and looked over at Tony. "Do you need help looking for him, T?" "Nah, I know where they are," Tony replied. Danny checked his watch and then looked back at Tony, a youthful appearance of impatience on his face. "You don't have to wait for me, Danny. I know right where they are, and I actually might hit the head before I leave anyways," Tony lied. Fearing that his lie was not fooling Danny, he opted for a bit of humor to try and lighten the tension. In his best authoritative voice, Tony joked, "I order you, as the senior officer on this site, to get the hell out of here and actually enjoy your long weekend." Danny laughed and waved to Tony. All right. Just be careful and enjoy your time off, too." Tony waved back. "I will." With that, Danny drove off, leaving Tony alone on the job site. He didn't waste any time heading back over to the buck hoist, a term that Tony still loved because how the makeshift elevator did, in fact, buck as it carried its loads up and down the construct. After a few moments, Tony found himself at the top level. Unlike the lower floors, the 8th didn't fully have the crude subfloor throughout it. There were plenty of spots that if you weren't paying attention, you could easily slip and fall through to the lower level. Or worse. Tony snapped the safety line onto his harness and walked over to the western edge of the floor. From here, he had an unobstructed view of the Pacific Ocean. He leaned up against one of the steel support beams and sank into the view. It was perfect. A few scattered white clouds floated like a halo around the warm orange sunset. The water sparkled like a billion diamonds. Tony would have stayed like that until the sun fully sank away, but he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned his head quickly to look at the far eastern face of the floor. Nothing was there. He stepped away from the beam and walked towards where he saw the movement. "Hello?" he called to the empty space. He knew he saw something. He checked behind some of the pallets and boxes of supplies that were scattered around the workspace. He said to himself. "Must have been a bird or something." Tony returned to his spot and resumed his sunset gazing when he again saw movement out of the corner of his eye. This time, Tony quickly walked the full length of the floor, hoping to catch some punk kid hiding spot to spot. "Hey, shithead," Tony yelled to his unknown guest. "This is an extremely dangerous construction site. It isn't safe to be running around up here. Come on out now, and I promise I won't whoop your ass." Tony's eyes darted around the floor, looking for a sign of movement. None came. Feeling extremely silly and realizing this evening has been ruined, Tony started to walk back to the buck hoist. He was about to step on when the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He spun quickly on his heels and looked back across the floor. That's when he saw her. She was peeking around a beam. She was pale, with gray-blue eyes and long, wild black hair hanging down to her waist. She wore a long white dress that didn't do much to hide a curvy body. She was gorgeous, and she was framed by the setting sun behind her. Tony was speechless. How did she get up here, he wondered. The buck hoist was still on the top level. He would have heard it go down and bring her back up. And he and Danny wrote it down like 15 minutes ago. She didn't say anything. She just stared at Tony from the other side of the beam, taking him in like he was a sight she couldn't explain. What are you doing here? Tony finally asked. Her face broke into the most playful of smiles. Her beauty, which had already been a thing of awe, had now become intoxicating. It took everything Tony had not to stumble forward and grovel at this goddess's feet. He shook his head, a feeble attempt to try and wake up from what had to be a dream, but the woman remained. She stepped out from behind the beam, showing that the right side of her body matched perfectly with her left. Tony was hoping for some kind of deformity to help him regain some composure. No such luck. It's really not safe for you to be up here, ma'am. Why don't you come down with me and I can get you an Uber or something? Tony was able to stammer out. She shook her head side to side and strode over to where Tony was admiring the sun only minutes before. She looked out over the ocean for a moment before looking back over her shoulder and beckoning Tony with her eyes to come and stand beside her. He stood stapled to the floor, afraid to move, afraid it would shatter this dream that was absolutely incredible. But she let out a soft, sweet little giggle and covered her mouth and nodded for him again. This time Tony couldn't resist. He walked over and stood shoulder to shoulder with her. She was even more breathtaking up close. Her blue-gray eyes danced with illumination from the setting sunlight. Her lips were a pale shade of crimson and stood out like a neon sign against her snow-white skin. She linked her fingers inside Tony's, an act that sent tingles through his hand. With her free hand, she pointed out over the sunset. But Tony didn't want to take his eyes off of her. What could a sunset offer now that he'd seen her beauty? But to his surprise, his head turned, and the sunset, which had been quite a sight before, was otherworldly now. The colors ran in waves towards him. The blues, whites, and oranges were all reaching out for him, calling him to their source. He turned back to the girl. Who was she? He had to be dreaming. It's the only explanation for this. What was happening? She then reached up, placed a hand softly on Tony's cheek, and guided him in for a kiss. A current ran through Tony's body, firing off all of his senses, all of them more alive than they ever had been. Her breath was cool in his mouth and throat, like an inhale after chewing on a peppermint. Her soft tongue danced across his own. Her embrace got tighter, her hand firm on his back, holding him to her. Tony, not entirely in control of his own movements, found himself running his right hand over the small of her own back, before settling down on a more than pleasant spot a little lower. This seemed to excite her, as the rate and passion of her kissing increased. Tony took this as a good sign and brought his left hand up along her side, climbing over the front of her dress. He gave her breast the softest of squeezes, and again an increased ferocity to her kisses. He slipped his hand under her dress and started caressing her breast proper, toying with her nipples, which stood at attention upon contact. She took his right hand from behind and led it around to her inner thigh, and up. Her back arched as he touched her, and let out a sensual gasp. Her first audible sound, Tony briefly thought, as he worked his fingers within. She, in turn, reached her hand down to the front of Tony's pants. His jeans at this point were ready to pop. With one hand, she worked the belt, button, and zipper free. She gently massaged Tony for a few moments before climbing him and guiding him inside her. Tony's eyesight went white. The ecstasy he felt was the single greatest he had ever felt in his entire life. He felt as though he were floating. In fact, he actually was. He reluctantly tore his gaze away from the unbelievable woman he was interlocked with and noticed the two of them were floating several feet off the floor in the last rays of the sunshine that crept over the horizon. If he had any doubts in his mind, Tony now knew for sure he was dreaming. Her gyrations doubled in effort. She let out increasingly louder moans to coincide with them. As they floated off the edge of the building, Tony could not control himself anymore, and the two let out passionate cries as he finished inside of her. He pulled her in for a tight embrace, his head resting on her shoulder, as he watched the sun twinkle out its final gasps at the far edge of the sea. She started to giggle slow and soft. A chill started to grow over Tony as he looked at the night sky. Her giggle picked up pace and became a full-on laugh. Her laugh quickly became a shrill cackle. Are you okay? Tony asked her.
Okay. I haven't felt this good in years, lover.
Tony pulled back from his embrace, and he wished like hell he hadn't. The thing wrapped around him was not the beautiful woman who he had just had sex with. Instead, there was a grotesque, rotting corpse holding him afloat in the sky. Her once snow-like skin had been replaced by one of putrid piss yellow, her long, wild black hair replaced with thin gray strands, her pale scarlet lips blistered, colorless. What were formerly her deep gray-blue eyes now were sunken and hollow, with milky white irises. God, no! Tony screamed as he tried to pull himself away from the thing.
Oh, lover, don't you want another kiss?
It hissed and pulled him back in. No, help me, Tony whined. The corpse continued to cackle.
No foreplay, huh? You want to go straight to round 2 then? Some good hard fucking,
it said as it started rubbing against Tony. He looked down in horror as its gnarled and disgusting body got closer. Loose skin draped from places loose skin shouldn't be. Its once ample breasts were now empty flesh sacks. Her white dress was a stained rag, not covering nearly enough of her shriveled and decaying form.
Or how about a real treat?
It croaked.
How about I'll suck your cock?
It smiled, revealing a few rotten teeth, as an unnaturally long green tongue wormed its way out of her mouth and licked the front of her lips. At the sight of this, Tony threw up all over himself.
So what's it gonna be, lover?
It teased. Please, Tony begged. Please, just let me go. Let me go, he screamed and redoubled his efforts to loosen her grip.
As you wish.
It laughed as it dropped Tony. He only now looked down and realized that he was a good 5 feet past the western edge of the building. He began to fall. He was going to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. The corpse continued to cackle as he dropped foot by foot until snag, Tony's safety line caught him. He hung there stunned and screaming. He looked around, but the corpse was gone. It took several minutes for Tony to get back to the building and get his feet under him again. He sat there panting on the 8th floor, eyeing every shadow, expecting her to pop out of it and come back for him. She never did. Despite this encounter, Tony continued to work the site for the next several weeks until the job was completed. But he was never the same. He was a man who used to pride himself on being the first man in and the last man out every day. That was no longer the case. Danny asked Tony on one of the final days of the job what happened to him, why he'd gone through such a drastic change in such a short amount of time, why he was always hightailing it out of there like a man on fire every night. Tony told him that he no longer trusted the sunset. When Danny asked what the hell that meant, Tony said, "I've seen what hides in it, and I never want to see it again." This has been a production of Fear Point. If you enjoy this episode and you're listening to it in podcast form, please follow and download the episode. It'll greatly help us. If you're listening to it on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thank you.